Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. In my recent R3 review, I said that the R3 is one of the best cameras I've used to date. However, I don't use it that much for photos and mainly use it for videos. So how does that make sense? And how does the R5 affect this decision? The R3 is basically superior to the R5 in every way, except for one thing, but that's an important thing. So let's find out what that is and how I plan to use both cameras in the field going forward. Personally, I own two R5 cameras and one R3. When you hold an R3 and an R5 with the battery grips side by side, you notice that they're actually pretty similar in size and weight, with the R3 actually being slightly lighter. So while they are similar size and weight, the R3 body is definitely far more sophisticated. It lies perfectly in your hand, it feels great, it's very well weather sealed, and all the buttons are just in the right places, and you also have that awesome multi-controller in the back that really easily allows you to move the autofocusing points around. So when it comes to the body and the overall design, the R3 is the clear winner, where everything just feels in the right place, and if I had to pick my favorite camera body ever, it would definitely be the R3. The R5 is great, but it just feels a little bit more pieced together with the separate battery grip. And one of the things I really don't like about the R5 is the positioning of the joystick in the battery grip. Because if you're shooting vertically, it's almost impossible to reach this joystick with your thumb. So that's something I don't like. The R5 is still a great body and feels nice in your hand, but when it comes to functionality and layout, the R3 is the clear winner for me. Both of these cameras actually have one CF Express Type B slot and one SD card slot. Personally, if I had the choice, I would definitely prefer to see two CF Express Type B cards in there, but I guess we can't have everything, and hopefully going forward Canon will at some point abandon those slow SD cards. The R3 shoots up to 30 frames per second in electronic shutter mode, and the R5 shoots up to 20 frames per second in electronic shutter mode. The one key big difference here is that the R3 is able to shoot 14-bit RAWs in all mode, whereas the R5 starts to shoot 12-bit RAWs in the electronic shutter mode. So there's an increase in image quality with a little bit less noise and easier to edit files when it comes to the R3 because they're 14-bit. So for instance, if you underexpose and pull up the file a lot, it will show less noise. And both cameras shoot 12 frames per second in the mechanical shutter mode. There's another advantage on the R3, and that is that you can actually change the speed of the electronic shutter. On the R5, it's always 20 frames per second, whereas on the R3, for instance, you can change it to 15 frames per second. So that can be an advantage as well if you don't always want to shoot at that highest frame rate. One thing I know a lot of people would like about the R3 is that it has an optional shutter sound. The R5 is completely silent when you use the electronic shutter, whereas on the R3 you can select a shutter sound and you can also select how loud you want to have that shutter sound. So you can have it very faint or very loud, almost like a DSLR camera. Personally, I love completely silent shooting, so I don't have it activated at all, but it's definitely something I know a lot of people have been asking for, and hopefully Canon might even introduce that in the R5 at some stage. Another big difference is that the R5 cannot shoot flash in the electronic shutter mode, whereas the R3 can shoot flash in the electronic shutter mode. So if you're planning on using a lot of flash, the R3 has definitely a big advantage there. The R3 has a 24 megapixel stacked BSI sensor, whereas the R5 has a non-stacked 45 megapixel sensor. So having that stacked sensor on the R3 allows for much faster readout speeds, which in return has basically no rolling shutter effect in the images, whereas on the R5 at times you can see a clear noticeable rolling shutter effect. So that's definitely another advantage on the R3, having that stacked sensor and having that fast readout speed. When it comes to the buffer size, both cameras have a decently sized buffer, but it's relatively easy to hit the buffer on the R5, and I often shoot in C-RAW to have a larger buffer because the files are smaller on the R5. Because if I'm shooting in electronic shutter mode with full RAW, it doesn't take long to hit the buffer at all, and it actually takes a while to clear it again. On the R3, however, the buffer seems better sized, and also the files are smaller, so it's quite quick to write to the card, and it's very hard to hit the buffer on the R3, whereas on the R5 I sometimes hit the buffer. So when it comes to the buffer size, the R3 with the smaller files definitely has an advantage. Let's talk about the EVF, especially here on the R3. You can see how it's protruding out from the back of the camera and how big and nice it is. Both of the cameras actually have the same resolution in the EVF, but the R3 has no lag or blackout, whereas the R5 has a little bit of lag or blackout at times, especially when you're shooting in the electronic shutter mode. On the R5, you're basically seeing a really fast slideshow of the images you're taking rather than the live picture in the viewfinder. So at times what can happen if you're following a bird that's flying really fast and it suddenly flies up or down or stops, because you're not seeing the live picture, you might actually keep moving and then lose track of the bird. This is much better done on the R3, where you basically see the live picture in the EVF, and so it's much easier to follow fast action. So there's a clear advantage in the EVFs when it comes to the R3. When it comes to the battery life, the bigger battery of the R3 obviously outperforms the smaller batteries of the R5, but not by as much as you might think. An R5 with the battery group and 2 batteries doesn't last as long as the R3, but the R3 also doesn't last forever. A Nikon Z9, for instance, lasts much longer. So all in all, battery life on both cameras is okay, but nothing really to write home about. One big advantage of the bigger battery in the R3 is that it can power, for instance, a second autofocus motor in a big 600 RF prime lens. So an R5 is not able to focus as fast on that lens as the R3 with the bigger battery. So having that bigger battery that's more powerful definitely helps with things like autofocusing speed. On older adapted EF lenses, both cameras actually perform very similar, and there's not much of a difference when it comes to speed or accuracy. On newer, faster RF lenses, however, there's a clear difference between the R3 and the R5, with the R3 being faster, a little bit more accurate, and also having much better image stabilization. For instance, on the RF 100 to 500mm lens, the R5 is very good, fast, and the viewfinder is relatively stable. But if you put an R3 on that lens, the viewfinder suddenly becomes rock solid. It almost doesn't move at all. It's very easy to do handheld video, and the lens also works super fast and super accurate, even more so than on the R5. So I definitely noticed the difference there with the new RF lenses, also like the 600 RF. The R3 is definitely faster and has better image stabilization than the R5. Let's talk about the autofocus and the autofocusing systems. Make sure to watch my review about the R3, because I talk a lot about the autofocusing system on the R3 there as well. The one main difference is that the R3 has the ability to track from every single autofocusing mode. So you can activate subject tracking in the menu, and then even your traditional spot autofocus can have tracking, and you can focus on a certain point and the camera will then stick and track that point, almost like the 3D tracking in the Nikon cameras. So while the R3 has that subject tracking and a lot more options and customization abilities, the difference in the autofocus is actually smaller than you may think. For perch birds, for instance, I noticed hardly a difference between the R3 and the R5. Both cameras find the subject very fast, track it very well, and give me nice and sharp photos. For action, the R3 may be a little bit stickier, a little bit faster, and a little bit more accurate, but the difference is not that huge. However, when it comes to that annoying mirrorless problem of the camera sometimes getting stuck on the background and not being able of focusing something that's much closer to you right in your viewfinder, there's a clear difference between the R3 and the R5, with the R3 being a lot more able to focus on the background and then back onto the subject. The R5 struggles a lot more with being stuck on the background, so Canon has definitely improved the autofocus in that regard on the R3. Where the R3's autofocusing system outshines any other camera I've used to date is in low light and very dark conditions. If I take the R5 to the deep dark rainforest, it struggles a fair bit to find the subject. It's hunting, it's zooming past it. It's not fun to use once it gets pretty dark and you have to use high ISO. The R3 in the same environment focuses much better, much more accurate, and much faster. So I noticed a clear improvement in low light. And on my recent Camp York trip, for instance, we were also photographing spotted nightjars that were just sitting on the road, and we were just illuminating them with the headlights of the car. And again, the R5 had decent trouble finding the bird, finding the eye, whereas on the R3 it was pretty fast, pretty quick. The camera found the eye and I could focus without problem. So overall, the R3's autofocusing system is the most sophisticated and performs the best overall, has the most options and also shines in low light. Yet, on many occasions, you actually won't notice much of a difference between the two cameras. I set up both cameras the same way. I have eye tracking on the AF on button, which is the multi-controller on the R3. And then I have normal spot autofocus on the star button. And the front shutter button is only there for taking images. It doesn't focus. So now we've talked a lot about the specs and how the cameras perform, but let's look at the images coming out of each camera, because this is where it gets very interesting. So while I prefer the R3 for most things, the one area I actually prefer the R5 is image quality. Don't get me wrong, the R3 takes great images that are super clean at high ISOs, but when you zoom in, there's just something left to be desired. When you zoom into an R5 45 megapixel file, it's a real wow moment. It's great and sharp with a lot of super nice fine detail. And while you have nice and sharp files with the R3 as well, it just doesn't have the same sort of crispness and fine details in the files that you can find in the R5 files. So in this Mulga Parrot example, for instance, we can see that the file with the R5 taken from the same position with the same lens just looks a little bit sharper with just a little bit more fine detail in the file. Another area where the R5 really shines is the ability to crop. It's basically like having a built-in 1.4 extender. Recently we were in the outback and photographing at a waterhole with a lot of different sized birds coming in. And that's where the R5 showed its true power, because I could sit far enough back to still get a big galah in the shot, but I also had the ability to crop in enough and still have a decent sized file when just a few little zebra finches were coming in. In this zebra finch example, both images were taken on the EF 600mm version 2 lens, one with the R3 and one with the R5. The R3 obviously got the best photo when the birds were just coming in. With the R5, the birds were just leaving. But it's a good example to show you the difference in file size, because after cropping, the R3 file has about 9 megapixels left, whereas the same crop on the R5 has over 18 megapixels left. So it's a big difference. If you're selling this to a calendar company or magazine or want to print it large, that difference can be quite dramatic and make or break your image sale. So while you don't necessarily need 45 megapixels off the R5, I think there's a distinct advantage in the field, at least for how I photograph. If you're a sports shooter and you quickly send off the files, then having the 45 megapixels is probably not an advantage to you. But for me, having the flexibility and the croppability in the field and the better fine detail with more crispness in the files, it's something that I really value, and the main reason that I have trouble committing to the R3 being my main camera. Let's look at the noise, because this is where the R3 has a clear advantage. For instance, in this case, in the rainforest shot at 25,600 ISO, the R5 file on the left of the female log runner shows significantly more noise than the R3 on the right hand side. Of course, if you downsize the R5 file, the noise levels will be a little bit different, but I think the R3 has at least 1 to 2 stops advantage over the R5. With the R5, I'm usually not wanting to go more than 12,800 ISO, whereas on the R3 I can use 25,600 ISO without even thinking about it, and I could probably even edge a bit higher if I really need to in some extreme cases. So when it comes to the ability to shoot in low light, focus in low light, and have clean files in low light, the R3 is the clear winner. However, now that we have good noise reduction software like DX or Pure Raw, actually getting rid of the noise in either camera is not really a problem, and you end up with some nice, basically noise-free images from both cameras. Now many of you might say, but what about software like Topaz Gigapixel AI Yarn? You can just use your R3 file, upsize it to the R5 file size, and you're done. In this example of the Mali ringneck taken with the same lens from the same position, one with the R3, one with the R5, we can see that the R5 file just has more detail. And now let's have a look what happens when we use Topaz Gigapixel AI. I actually ran the file through all of the different options like low resolution, art, standard, whatever they have, and I picked the best looking picture. So here now on the left hand side we have the upsized R3 file to the size of the R5, and on the right hand side we have the file of the R5. And I don't know what you think, but I think the R5 file still looks significantly better because the R3 file was lacking fine detail from the start, and then even a good software like Topaz Gigapixel AI can't add that detail. If anything, it looks even a little bit more kind of smushed over now. So for me, when it comes to file size, crispness and fine detail, the R5 is just the clear winner. Other thing you want to consider when using programs like Topaz Gigapixel AI is that it takes a long time to run these files through that program. So to upsize the R3 to an R5 file, it takes way over 1 minute. So if I wanted to do that to 100 images, it would add significant time to my workflow, and that's not something that I would really want to do. With both of these cameras, especially when shooting at high ISO and using Adobe products, you have to have a great editing. I usually run my images through DxO Pure Raw first to remove the noise. Then I use my presets to get the colors right and get me to a great starting point with the raw file. And then I use my workflow that I teach step by step in my masterclass to get to my final looking image. So if you want to learn how to make your own images look great, I would highly recommend that you check out my presets and masterclass down there in the description. I know that will help you a lot. Let's talk about video, because this is where the R5 should outperform the R3, but it's actually the other way around for me, and the R3 has been a fantastic video camera. Of course, it doesn't shoot 8K, but it shoots beautiful 4K and 6K. What I love about both cameras, and that's actually the only two cameras that can do it, is that they can directly film from photo mode simply by pressing the record button, and then you're recording in whichever settings you've saved as custom function number 3 in video mode. So it's very easy to quickly take some photos, press record, take some video, press record again to stop, and you're back in photo mode. So the ability to quickly switch between photo and video is second to none in both of these cameras. What's also great that you have 3 different custom function video modes, because then you can save all the difficult to get to video modes as a custom function and they become very easily accessible. So when it comes to functionality and handling in video, the R3 and the R5 are by far the best 2 cameras I've used. For instance, a Nikon Z9 cannot film out of photo mode at all, and you have to turn a switch to be able to film from photo mode. The R3 actually has this dedicated video photo switch on the back of the camera. The R5 doesn't have it at all, and I actually assigned this little MFN button at the top to switch between photo and video, and then it's also just the press of one button to switch between photo and video. So on both of these cameras this works very well, and with just one click you can switch between photo and video. Where the R5 really struggles is heat. I know you've heard all about overheating, but while I was living in Melbourne in a cooler climate with less humidity, it wasn't really a problem. But ever since I moved to Queensland with hotter temperatures, more humidity, the overheating has become a real issue for me. And it got really bad on my recent Cape York trip, where basically whenever I switched an R5 to video, it was overheated or had almost no record limit left. So the only camera that constantly worked and was trustworthy on that Cape York trip for video was the R3, because it never overheated or had any issues for me in that regard. So that was really great. And actually, I even set it up as a remote camera on a tripod to film a golden-shouldered parrot nest. So I set up the camera in the dark, hid it amongst the bushes, and then connected it to my phone via Wi-Fi. And from time to time, I would start on my phone the recording and record in 6K raw light. And to my surprise, the camera didn't overheat and I had no issues at all. And when I went to collect the camera, it was actually so hot that I could hardly touch it, but it would still function and film. So when it comes to the ability to sustain heat and have no overheating, the R3 definitely wins. And it also doesn't have that silly 29:59 record limit that the R5 has. So in cold climates, both of these cameras will actually work quite well, but anywhere else, the R3 will definitely outperform the R5 when it comes to video. So unless you need 8K, In my opinion, the R3 is the better video camera. When it comes to 4K, both of these cameras shoot beautiful, nice and sharp, oversampled 4K in 30, 60 and 120 frames per second. And the R3 also shoots beautiful 6K RAW and 6K RAW Light. And the 6K RAW Light has quickly become one of my favorite formats. It's a great compromise between editing ability, image quality and resolution. And it's actually also easier to edit than the H.265 coming out of the R5, which is a real killer for most computers. While the video autofocus on the R5 is very good, the video autofocus on the R3 is another level. And having the ability to have the subject tracking on in every mode now really helps me when filming. On the R5, the only option to use eye tracking is when you let the camera find the subject all over your viewfinder. There's not much control you have as to where you want the camera to focus. On the R3, however, I can now use spot autofocus or an autofocusing field with expanded fields around it or a smaller zone, move that zone onto my subject, and then have the camera only focus in that smaller area. And that's actually working really well for video. So what I usually do is I use the multi-controller to move the zone onto my subject and then keep it on the subject with the multi-controller. And because it works so well, I don't introduce any extra shake to the video as well. So having the ability to customize the autofocus more to keep it more on your subject is a clear advantage for me in video mode. And that's another reason why I really like the R3 for video. Another area where I prefer the R3 is in the studio. While the R5 is very good with the human tracking, the R3 seems to be a little bit better and doesn't get as quickly distracted if I move or have something in front of my face. So now we're in a very interesting situation, aren't we? The R3 has the much better sensor with much better high ISO performance, faster readout and no rolling shutter. But I actually prefer the files coming out of the R5 because they're crisper with more fine detail and I have a much larger ability to crop. Where the R3 is much better is in low light and challenging conditions, as well as fast action with 30 frames per second, no rolling shutter and no blackout or lag in the viewfinder. So in those scenarios, I will happily grab the R3, but in other cases, like at that Outback waterhole where I need to crop a bit and don't know what size bird will actually come in, I will most likely grab my R5. So the logical conclusion will actually be an R1 somewhere down the road, maybe end of this year, early next year, that has 45 plus megapixels and an R3 body with the R3 autofocus system and all the great ergonomics. But until then, I will actually use a mix of both cameras. The R3 will be my main video camera because it does so well there, and it will be my specialized action and low light camera. Whereas the R5 will be my main all-purpose camera when I need a bit more resolution, when I want ultimate image quality, and when I want to have the ability to crop. Do you have an R5 or an R3? Are you looking at both cameras? What are your experiences with both cameras? Let me know in the comments. I think if you're looking for an all-purpose camera, a good all-rounder that can do everything pretty well and has great image quality, the R5 will be the camera for you. But if you want the best of the best, fast action, great low light performance, then the R3 will be the camera of choice if you don't mind the 24 megapixel. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, my personal insight into the R3 and the R5 and my reasoning why the R3 is my sort of action and low light and video camera and the R5 being my main sort of bird photography camera. Make sure to let me know your thoughts in the comments about both cameras. Give me a thumbs up for the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you guys very soon. Bye!